Hello there. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Galactic Archives. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Give me just a moment. There we go. Before we begin, I want to offer a gentle content note for tonight's reading. The chapters we're sharing, which are chapters 10 and 11 of Steps into the Past, take place during Marin's early recovery after Collier. These scenes explore physical healing, trauma, quiet watchfulness, and the slow return of safety. While there's no graphic content in these chapters, the emotional weight is present, and themes of recovery, exhaustion, and the after effects of violence are woven throughout. If at any point you need to step away, stretch, get water, or simply sit quietly with the story, please do so. There's no pressure to stay engaged every single second. Please take care of yourselves first. Tonight is about stillness, about the space between survival and living again, and about what it means to be held by people, by place, and by quiet. So, if you're ready, let's return to Tanagis. Also, Wraith, thank you very much for that 5-stream watch streak. Very much appreciated. I think that's the first time I've had somebody have a watch streak, so thank you. Appreciated. Let me get situated here. I'm going to move some screens around. I need to figure out the automation for that. Stream Deck apparently can do that, so I'll have to figure that one out. Alright. Need some water. Again. Steps into the Past. Chapter 10. Between Ash and Breath. Veiled Currents. The Valkyrie glided into dock under the pale light of Gatane's orbital lattice, a massive silhouette easing against the glittering frame of the docking ring. From the portside viewport, Marin caught her first glimpse of the moon's steel crown, a sprawl of docking spires, refueling pylons, and long skeletal bridges that linked one colossal structure to another. Beyond, the planet Catan turned slowly in the black, its cloud bands catching the distant light of its sun like molten glass poured over deep seas. The carrier shuddered gently as the docking tractor beams locked in, the vibration humming through the deck plates, through her boots, and straight into the marrow of her bones. It was a reminder that they were leaving the relative anonymity of deep space. Here, at Catane, every arrival was logged, every face accounted for. There were too many eyes, and definitely too many ears. Greer was waiting in the passageway when the call for secured docking came over the intercom. He stood like he always did, his shoulders squared, his weight balanced just forward on his boots, and his gaze level and unreadable. The only sign of tension was in the set of his jaw as his eyes flicked to her fatigues, now properly marked with her name in black-on-black rank tabs, and then to the corridor beyond. "Stay close, Private," he said simply, his voice low but carrying the kind of weight that didn't need volume to enforce. Vec loitered a few paces ahead near the hatch to the transfer corridor, his posture loose but his eyes sweeping like a predator on the edge of a herd. Between the two men, they'd already charted every movement on this deck since docking clearance had come through. Marin had peeled off toward flight ops half an hour ago, while Dance had headed toward personnel intake. Their presence was a problem neither Greer nor T could touch yet, but they weren't about to let it near her here, not after Collier. As they moved off the carrier and into the long, brightly lit spine of the docking ring, Marin could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Catane smelled of oil, metal, and ozone, the tang of naval engineering, of warships being born and remade. Uniformed personnel strode past in steady waves, Marine detachments rotating planetside, naval crews trading shifts, pilots striding in 2s and 3s toward debriefing towers. Heads turned once or twice toward the new arrivals from Valkyrie, but most eyes just slid on past. Greer saw to that with a quiet efficiency that would have impressed even Ethan. Every time someone's gaze lingered too long on her or her fatigues, Greer moved, stepping just slightly into their line of sight, and offering a curt nod or an offhand comment that drew their attention away. Vec mirrored the dance from the other side, their formation an unspoken cordon as they ushered her through the press of bodies toward the secure marine lifts. To anyone else, it looked like a pair of NCOs shepherding a junior Marine fresh off a rough op. To those who knew what to look for, it was deliberate shielding, the kind born of long habit and even older promises. They reached the checkpoint to the officer's transfer wing, where the noise of the shipyard dulled under thick security doors and reinforced bulkheads. Here, the lighting softened to a steady, clinical glow. The Marine sentry on duty glanced up from his datapad, his eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity at Marin's lack of proper unit insignia, but Greer's presence loomed beside her, steady and immovable. Theta 9, assigned under Captain IT, Greer said. His tone clipped, every syllable a wall. The designation slid across the room like a locked hatch. The sentry didn't question it. He just logged them in under Veil protocol and looked elsewhere. The lift to the Marine officer section was quiet, the kind of silence that hummed with the weight of things unspoken. Marin stood between Greer and Vec, her shoulders squared, her eyes forward, the tags cold against her collarbone where she slipped her hand under her uniform tunic to touch them once. It wasn't fear. Not anymore. Just the instinctive awareness of how thin the line between safety and exposure was in a place like this. When the lift opened onto a quieter corridor, Greer finally broke the silence, his voice pitched low enough only she could hear. We'll get you settled quickly, Private. Then you rest. I'll run point on what comes next. His glance toward Vec was brief but sharp, the kind of look that carried whole orders without even uttering a word. Vec dipped his head in the faintest acknowledgement without a word. Marin nodded once, simple, quiet motion. She didn't need to speak to let him know she understood. 3 days out from Collier and the echoes of that fight still clung to her bones. Here on Catane, the game was shifting again. Currents moving under the surface, and every instinct told her that the watchful eyes they'd worked so hard to evade hadn't gone far. Give me just 1 second. Glasses are sitting a little funny. Between signals and silence. The auxiliary hangar bay was dimly lit, the kind of subdued glow Connors preferred during Veil operations. The overhead glow panels were set to a muted amber, casting long shadows over the shuttle crouched near the far bulkhead. Its matte charcoal gray hull bore no markings, not even the faint stenciled numbers a Marine craft usually carried. From the outside, it was just another maintenance shuttle waiting for orders. To the men and women in this bay, it was a lifeline, a ghost waiting to vanish into the dark. Greer stood at the edge of the ramp, his helmet clipped to his belt, his stance that peculiar balance of parade ground stillness and a predator's readiness. He hadn't slept much in the past 3 days, not properly, and the lines under his eyes spoke of it, but his gaze was as sharp as ever, sweeping the bay, the veil-cleared deck crew, and the sealed access points. Every twitch of his jaw carried a silent weight. This had to go exactly right. Vec was already moving around the shuttle itself, methodically double-checking the seals on the hatch and the power conduits. He didn't speak, not to the deck crew, nor to Greer, just offered a quick hand signal every few moments. Clear, secured, ready. Their kind of language was pared down to bone and muscle memory, every flick of a hand meaning more than most words could say. They'd been doing this since Bastine, since the day Greer had seen a half-dead girl carried out of hell, and swore to the Manda and the lady alike that it would never happen on his watch ever again. 2 more Veil Marines waited near the rear bulkhead, their gear stripped down to essentials, their armor bore no identifiers. Both men had been part of the extraction detail 2 years ago. They were the only ones outside of Greer and Vec that Connors trusted with this kind of movement. They kept their eyes to the deck plating, their shoulders set, the quiet gravity of Veil protocol hanging around them like a second skin. They knew the stakes. Admiral Connors arrived without ceremony, just a shadowed figure in the hatchway before he stepped inside, datapad in hand, his expression as unreadable as ever. His voice, when he stepped inside, was pitched so low that only those in the bay could hear it. Theta 9 departs in 20. Your flight plan's already embedded in System Veil protocols. No official record of the shuttle leaving Valkyrie. He looked from Greer to Vec, making certain they both understood. You do not deviate. If this movement so much as brushes a sensor ping outside of Veil clearance lanes, I'll have half the fleet asking questions we can't afford. Aye, sir, Greer answered quietly, meeting Connor's gaze just long enough to make the weight of his words clear. There was no bravado in his tone. There was no need for it. Just the steady certainty of a Marine who had walked this Rager's edge before and intended to do so again. She won't be seen. She won't be heard. Connors gave a small, approving nod before stepping closer. His gaze flicked toward the shuttle where Marin sat in the forward jump seat of the troop compartment, her head bowed slightly. She raised his tag sliding through her fingers on a loop. She was in fatigues now, clean, but she still looked too pale and too worn for a girl her age. Connors let his eyes linger a heartbeat longer, something unreadable crossing his features before he scolded away. She's got 3 days. No more, he said quietly, his tone firm but carrying a weight beneath it. Any longer and questions start hitting the wrong ears. You keep her under Veil protocol. Understood, Greer said. It wasn't a promise. It was a fact. Connor's gaze shifted to Vec next. No comms unless you're in trouble or homebound. You send a report, it's only via Veil encryption. Theta 9 designation, nothing else. Not a name, not even a hint. Vec answered with a sharp nod, a subtle flick of his fingers following. A gesture that meant, we'll burn the sky clean if it comes to it. Connors read it and gave a tight flicker of acknowledgement, and then handed the datapad over to Greer. These are the codes you'll need if the lanes close early. They self-delete after use. With that, Connor stepped back, his presence folding away like the shadow of a tide retreating. The bay was quiet again after the hatch closed behind him, save for the low hums of the shuttle's systems warming from standby. Greer turned, his boots whispering against the deck as he approached the ramp. Marin looked up at him then, her eyes tired but steady. She didn't speak. She didn't really need to. He crouched, resting one forearm over her knee, his voice pitched just for her. You good to move, Theta 9? Her lips twitched into the smallest ghost of a smile at the code name, even as she shifted stiffly, the movement careful around bruised ribs and half-healed burns. Aye, Master Sergeant, she murmured, her voice quiet but carrying that stubborn core of fire he'd come to recognize. He reached out, not quite touching her shoulder, just letting the presence of his hand be felt. A silent tether. You sleep this time. Me, Vec, and the boys will watch the lanes. You just breathe. For a moment, something unspoken hung in the space between them, and then Marin dipped her head, gripping the tags tighter as if to anchor herself. Copy that. Greer gave her a firm nod, rose, and glanced toward Vec. A small flick of 2 fingers. Shields up, eyes out. Vec returned it instantly, sliding past him to take position near the hatch controls, his gaze sweeping the bay once more. Every movement was fluid and practiced, a ritual of protection as old as the men who bore it. When the bay doors finally cycled open, there was no fanfare, no farewell. The shuttle lifted on whispering repulsors and glided out into the black beyond the Madcon field. No transponder, no name. Just a phantom sliding into the silent lanes, carrying a girl who had survived too much, and the Marines who would burn every Veil code they had before letting history repeat itself. Shadow descent. The shuttle slid through the upper atmosphere like a silent shadow, its hull darkened and unmarked per Veil protocols. Every comm was locked down tight and running under Veil-band encryption. From the outside, it was nothing but another unremarkable personnel transfer, a small Marine escort ship bringing its passengers home after deployment. Inside, the quiet was heavier than the vacuum beyond the reinforced hull. It weighed on the air, as tangible as the armor plates stacked in the rear compartment and the rifles slung low across the shoulders of the Marine escort. Marin sat strapped into one of the forward jump seats, the muted hum of repulsors thrumming up through the soles of her boots. Her fatigues were clean and crisp now, the name tape stitched above her heart, the black rank insignia on her collar where it belonged. To anyone outside the Veil, she was just another Marine rotating home after an off-world exercise. But Greer's presence opposite her, his posture deceptively relaxed but his eyes never leaving the hatch, made it clear that this wasn't a routine drop-off. It was an extraction layered in quiet codes and old instincts. Vec was next to her, his expression neutral, his helmet resting on his knees. To the untrained eye, he looked to be half asleep, a Marine catching a moment's rest after long hours. But Marin had learned enough since Bastine to catch the faint cues he used. The subtle shift of weight when someone passed behind him, the way his eyes tracked each flicker of the status lights along the bulkhead. Greer had taught him to see everything without seeming to look. He was here to watch her six, and they both knew it. Marin didn't speak. She hadn't spoken much since boarding on Valkyrie's secure deck 3 hours ago, beyond the required nods and quiet, "Aye, Master Sergeant." Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers unconsciously curled around Jarius's tags, the metal warmed by her touch. She let the familiar weight of them anchor her against the flicker of memory still clinging to her ribs and shoulders like phantom burns. Collier wasn't behind her yet. Not really. The smell of scorched armor, the crackle of lightning in the air, the face of the woman who'd singled her out with a hatred Marin couldn't understand. It lingered every time she closed her eyes. The shuttle bucked softly as it slipped through another layer of atmosphere, the hull groaning in protest. Greer didn't look up from the datapad on his knee, but Marin caught the faintest flick of his gaze toward the cockpit, a check-in he didn't need to voice. Everything in the shuttle was quiet but deliberate, the way only veil-cleared Marines moved when stakes ran higher than anyone outside could know. Minutes stretched long before the pilot's voice finally broke the silence over the internal channel. Coming over the ridge now, 2 minutes to the estate landing pad. Marin glanced sideways toward the viewport. Through the polarized transparisteel, the vast sweep of Tanagis spread out beneath them, the forest dark and endless, the mountains cutting jagged edges against the pale light of dawn. Home. At least, what passed for it now. The sight stirred something deep and complicated in her chest. Relief edged with something sharper. Coming back always felt different now, like a breath half-held. The shuttle banked, dropping lower over the Dursa Range, the familiar outline of the estate's landing pad coming into view below, quiet and isolated among the trees. She exhaled slowly, trying to let the tension bleed from her shoulders. But even now, with the weight of home below them, she could feel the unspoken truth braided through every action of the Marines flanking her. The veil never lifted. Safety was a word used softly and cautiously, like it might shatter if he pressed too hard. The shuttle banked low over the dark sweep of pines, skimming along the ridgeline that bordered the Dursa estate like a natural rampart. The morning mist clung to the valley, curling over the treetops and spilling into the ravine below like slow-drifting smoke. The mountains loomed, old and silent, their peaks catching the first weak gleam of dawn. Marin sat forward slightly, as if by leaning closer to the viewport she could anchor herself to the sight. 2 years ago, she'd been too far gone to see any of it, carried through the same approach under blackout sedation, waking only when the pain allowed. This time, she was awake, and every heartbeat between sky and stone pressed its own weight on her ribs. The soft clink of Jarius's tags between her fingers was the only sound she made. Greer stood near the ramp, one gauntleted hand braced on the overhead rail, watching the landing with the steady patience of a man who had done this 1,000 times, but never once like this. His gaze swept the horizon through the small viewports, noting terrain, possible approaches, and every shadow that shifted wrong. Vec mirrored his stance on the opposite side, his helmet angled just enough to signal readiness. Harris and Rowell checked their rifles out of habit, though they weren't expecting a fight here. Veil or not, their instinct ran deeper than orders. The landing pad came into view, a flat stretch of stone cut into the mountain shelf, edged by pines and guarded by the high walls of the estate's outer perimeter. 2 figures waited at the pad's edge, silhouettes framed by the low-hanging mist. Ethan Bevan, his armor plates dulled to the black that had seen too many wars, and Jared Algren, lean and steady despite the way his boots shifted subtly as if he couldn't decide between pacing or standing still. Jared had been there for their arrival home from Bastine. Bell clearance had bought him this one thing: to be here when she came home battered, not absent again. He stood with his arms crossed, his blue eyes fixed on the descending shuttle, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. The shuttle settled onto the smooth stone with a soft hiss, the repulsors kicking dust and pine needles across the pad. The ramp dropped with barely a sound, mist curling inside the crew compartment like ghostly breath. Greer was the first to step down, scanning the perimeter with the automatic precision of a man who trusted no world to stay safe just because he willed it. Vec followed, his visor sweeping the tree line before nodding once, signaling clear. Harris and Rawl flanked the ramp, a quiet wall as Marin stepped forward. We have an ad starting in 4.5 minutes, my friends. She hesitated for the barest second at the top of the ramp, her hand tightening on Jarius' tags. The mountain air was cool and sharp, full of pine resin and stone, a smell that was home in a way no other place in the galaxy could be. She swallowed hard and forced her boots to move, every step down the ramp a little steadier than the last, despite the echo of pain in her ribs. Ethan met her halfway across the pad. He didn't speak. Not here. Not now. But his hand came up warm and solid against the back of her neck for a brief moment before falling away. A wordless weight that said, "You made it." The kind of anchor that only he could give. Jared hung back a fraction longer, as if unsure of his place. And then he stepped forward, stopping just close enough that she didn't have to reach. The quiet in his expression was different from Ethan's. It wasn't born of age or war survived, but of promises made in silence and kept without words. "You're late," he said softly, his voice steady but threaded with something tight. It wasn't a reprimand, it was an anchor, the kind you throw out to stop yourself from drifting too far. Marin blinked fast, her lips twitching like she might smile but couldn't quite manage it. "Traffic," she whispered back, her voice rasped, thin but honest, and just like that, something in Jared's stance eased, fraction by fraction. Behind them, Greer gave Ethan the slightest nod, a subtle report of clear perimeter, no tails, veil intact. Ethan returned it with the barest twitch of his jaw, already sweeping the tree line himself before signaling toward the estate. The veil escort closed in just enough to keep their circle tight as they crossed the pad, boots whispering over stone, the mist curling around their legs. The estate loomed ahead, quiet and still, its gates already open, the path to safety lit in muted gold. For the first time since Collier, Marin felt the press of watchfulness around her not as a suffocating weight, but as a promise. Whatever shadows followed, they wouldn't cross this threshold easily, not with Ethan, Jared, and the old ghost from Bastine standing between her and the dark. A threshold once crossed. The stone path leading to the estate seemed longer than Marin remembered. Each step drew on reserve she barely had, every breath hitching faintly against ribs that still protested movement. The mountain air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth, grounding her more than the recycled chill of starship corridors ever could. But underneath it all, she carried the weight of Collier, the duel, the lightning, the screams, the bodies. It clung to her skin like ash that wouldn't wash away. Greer walked half a step behind her left shoulder, her duffel slung over one shoulder without being asked. Vec mirrored his pace just ahead of Marin, silent and watchful, their boots moving in a rhythm that only seasoned Marines shared. Harris and Rawl kept the rear perimeter loose but vigilant, their rifles angled casually, yet their eyes scanning the tree line as though Deathwatch might step from between the pines at any moment. The unspoken message was clear. They brought her home once before from Hellfire, and they weren't about to risk losing her on the last 100 meters. Jared stayed just to her right, close enough that she could feel his quiet presence, a tether between here and the edge of the battlefield she hadn't fully left. 2 years ago, he'd seen what was left of her after Bastine. The memory was in every silent footstep, every glance he cast over his shoulder to mark threats that weren't there. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Not alone this time, lingered between them like a vow. And I'm gonna pause right there because we have an ad starting in like 7 seconds. Please take this ad break to get some water, have a stretch, grab a snack if you need it. I'll see you when we get back. Alright, my friends, we are back from our ad break. Thank you so much for hanging out. Appreciate you. I do hope your weekend has been relaxing and that you were enjoying the stream so far tonight. As always, if you have any questions or comments regarding the story, please feel free to post them in chat and I will answer them when I get a moment. Let's get back to our chapter. The heavy wooden doors opened as they approached, spilling warm light onto the stone steps worn by generations of boots. Inside, the estate was hushed, alive with scents of hearth fire and tea steeping somewhere deeper inside. It was the first real warmth Marin had felt in days. Callista waited just inside. Her hair, a pale blonde streaked faintly with silver near the temples, was braided neatly, framing a face sharpened by worry. Blue eyes, piercing yet soft, swept over Marin in a single practiced glance. They missed nothing. The guarded set of her shoulders, the faint tremor in her fingers where she clutched Darius's tags, the lines of pain etched around her mouth despite her effort to mask them. Marin, Callista said, her voice low but carrying the steel of command honed from years on the battlefield and deck alike. She didn't step forward immediately. She waited, letting Marin cross the threshold on her own before closing the space between them, a quiet offer of presence rather than a demand. When they stood only a pace apart, she reached up to brush a lock of dark hair gently from Marin's temple, her fingers lingering briefly to test for fever or pallor. The gesture wasn't indulgent, it was clinical, protective, but rooted in care too deep to name. Marin leaned into the touch for a heartbeat, letting her eyes drift shut before she straightened, her jaw set in that stubborn line Callista knew far too well. "We're home," Marin murmured, her voice rough around the edges. Callista's eyes softened, but her tone tolerated no argument as she said, "You need to rest. Later you can tell me what they pulled you from out there, but not before I've looked over what Catherine did for you." Her gaze slid briefly to Greer, a quiet exchange sparking in the space of a second. "She's worse than she admits." Greer gave a single fractional nod, his lips pressed thin. He didn't have to say a thing. Beck moved ahead silently, opening the way toward the stairs and Marin's room beyond. Greer followed, placing the duffel on the bed before returning to his place near the door, ready to take the first watch with the same unshakable patience he'd had on Valkyrie. Harris and Raoul peeled away to establish perimeter positions, shadows in the dimming light outside. Marin hesitated on the threshold of the sitting room, her boots anchored in stone as though crossing it required courage she wasn't sure she had left. But Jared's quiet nod and Callista's unwavering gaze steadied her. She stepped inside at last, letting the warmth of the estate and the faint scent of mountain tea wrap around her like a fragile shield. For the first time in 3 days, her shoulders eased by the tiniest fraction. Home. For now, that word might hold. A vigil kept. The fire had burned lower, throwing soft shadows that wavered across the pale stone walls. The estate had fallen utterly silent, save for the muted creak of timber settling in the night air, and the faint whisper of wind threading through the pines outside. Tanagis smelled of mountain rain, the earth cool and clean, a far cry from the acrid stink of blaster fire and scorched metal that still haunted the edges of Marin's memory. She slept now, curled under her side under the fresh sheets and soft blankets that Callista had laid out. Darius's tags looped tight in her fist, as though letting go would untether her from the ground beneath her feet. Even in sleep, her face was drawn, a faint furrow etched between her brows, her breath catching now and then as if the dreamscape offered no true peace. Jared sat where he had from the moment Callista stepped quietly out of the room, cross-legged on the floor beside her bunk, his back to the wall, his hands loosely clasped but ready to reach for her if the night turned dark. Blonde hair fell messily into his eyes, but he didn't push it back. His gaze was fixed on Marin's face with that same steady, quiet focus he'd carried since Bastille. There we go. He remembered too vividly the weight of her body as he had laid her carefully in the medbay, limp and barely breathing. Remembered the silence of the medbay afterward, broken only by the rhythmic beeps that marked how close she had come to not returning at all. That memory hadn't dulled with time. It was stitched into him, into the way he instinctively remained near whenever she was hurt. The clearing on Tanagis, Korriban's dust and fire. It had been the same every time. When the galaxy had tried to break her, Jared had stayed, as if his presence alone could anchor her back to herself. Now, as the moonlight spilled in through the window, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He watched every twitch of her fingers against the sheets, every faint tremor in her breath, knowing the kind of battle she fought behind closed eyes. He said nothing and made no sound to wake her, just a quiet vow that if the ghost came too close, he'd be there to pull her free again. The house shifted faintly, a floorboard creaking somewhere down the hall. Jared's eyes flicked towards the door, instinctively alert before settling back on Marin. His hand moved, slow and cautious, shifting the blanket higher over her shoulder where it had slipped down. The simple act felt like something sacred, a way to remind her, even in sleep, that she wasn't alone, that someone was keeping watch. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the soft rustle of pine boughs like a lullaby. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, its glow painting the room in amber warmth. Jared leaned his head back against the wall, his gaze never leaving her. We didn't need words. Not tonight. Just his presence, a quiet, unshakable line in the sand between Marin and every shadow that still lingered from Collier. As long as she slept, he'd keep vigil, like he always had, and like he always would. Mm. Oh, there we go. The first light holds. Dawn came slowly, slipping over the peaks of the northern mountains and pouring pale gold light through the open shutters. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain clinging to pine and earth. Inside, the room stayed hushed, a fragile cocoon spun out of warmth and quiet, as though the world had agreed, just for this morning, not to demand anything more from her. Marin stirred before her eyes opened, her breath catching in her throat like she expected the weight of Collier to still be pressing her down, pinning her in smoke and blaster fire. A faint sound escaped her, low and ragged, and her hand clutched instinctively at Darius's tags, as if they were the only thing keeping her tethered. Jared had been awake for hours, sitting cross-legged near the bunk, his presence wrapped around her like a shield. He had long since reached out through the force, not to take the memories, never that, but to quiet the jagged edges. He touched her mind the way one would lay a palm on the nose of a skittish stallion, careful and deliberate, offering only steadiness, not pushing, nor soothing with false calm, just anchoring her to something solid and real when the nightmares tried to drag her under. Now, as she shifted again, he had let his awareness brush hers lightly. I'm here, a whisper in the force, not words so much as warmth, an echo of her every time he'd stood guard over her since Bastine, since before that, even. Since the first promise he'd made to himself on Monadon that if she ever fell, he'd help her stand again. Slowly, her breathing steadied. The tight furrow in her brow eased by a fraction. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Jared, not just his face, tired and unwavering, but the quiet light and the force that clung to him. The silent reassurance he offered without asking anything in return. For a long moment, she said nothing, just let her eyes rest on him as though she needed to be certain this wasn't some trick of sleep. You stayed, she whispered, her voice still rough from exhaustion. Jared's lips quirked in a faint wry half-smile. Told you I wasn't leaving. Something unknotted in her chest then, a breath shuddering out of her like the first crack in a dam holding back too much for too long. She shifted under the blankets, wincing a little at the ache still clinging to her ribs, and her free hand slipped free of the sheets, just enough that his could cover it. The contact grounded her more than anything else could have right now. For a while they stayed like that in silence, the soft hush of the morning broken only by the faint crackle of the hearth and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. Eventually, Marin's eyes drifted shut again, not dragged under by restless exhaustion this time, but pulled by genuine, much-needed rest. Jared didn't move. He didn't break the fragile calm. He just sat there, his hand over hers, his presence a steady beacon in the force, holding watch until the weight she carried eased enough that she could truly sleep. Okay, I need some water. between shadows and firelight. The fire in the old stone hearth burned low, not for lack of fuel, but because the quiet hours seemed to demand it. Warm embers more than roaring flame, heat that reached into the bones without casting harsh light. The scent of wood smoke mingled with steeping behot, its sharp spice cutting through the weariness clinging to the air like a second skin. "Hello, sniper." Marin sat curled in one of the leather chairs closest to the hearth, her knees drawn up slightly, a blanket Callista had pressed on her draped over her shoulders. The cup in her hands radiated gentle warmth, browning her fingers that still trembled faintly from pain and exhaustion. A plate sat on the low table beside her, empty but for crumbs, proof that Greer had won the quiet battle of wills to make sure she'd eaten. Greer himself stood at an angle near the doorway, his posture loose enough to look casual, yet every line of him spoke to readiness. His eyes tracked every shift of light, every breath in the room, and every faint noise beyond the closed door. Through the veil they'd all perfected, Marin could feel Vec and Harris stationed in the hallway, Ral covering the outer approach, a silent net of presence woven tight and unbroken. Across from her, Ethan sat in his usual way, one arm draped along the back of the chair, brown eyes steady on her, his graying brown hair catching faint glints from the firelight. His silence wasn't a command for her to speak, but an open space where she might. She'd grown up learning that tone, that unshakable patience, and tonight it tugged at something fragile inside her chest. She stared into the fire for a long while, the only sound the occasional clink of her cup as her hands shifted around it. When the words finally came, they were hoarse, uneven, and more confession than report. "She came for me," Marin said softly, her gaze still fixed on the embers. "Out of 30 of them, she zeroed in on me the second I reached out in the force. It wasn't random. She knew." Her breath hitched and she swallowed, her fingers tightening on the cup. "I fought Sith before, but this wasn't that. It was colder, trained, precise, like someone had written a manual on how to take apart a Jedi, and she'd memorized every line." Ethan's jaw flexed, but he stayed silent, letting her keep the floor. Greer's arms were folded now, his weight shifted subtly forward, but his face was carved from stone, giving nothing away except to those who knew how to read him. Marin drew a shaky breath and pressed on, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "She used everything. Ripper slugs to test me, lightning to keep me down, and pushed me hard enough to make me pull deeply, too deeply on the Force. I thought that if I didn't, I'd die, or worse, she'd take someone else down to get to me. I don't even remember all of it, just pain, and heat, and fear that I couldn't let anyone see." Her voice cracked on the last word, barely audible over the pop of the fire. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice low and firm, the way he'd speak to Marin under fire. "Marin." Just her name, but it landed like a tether thrown across a gulf, drawing her eyes up to meet his, brown to blue, a quiet anchor in the storm. "You held the line. That's what matters." She blinked rapidly, her vision blurring as heat stung her eyes. "I wasn't strong enough to stop her without pulling on the Force too much. If it happens again..." Ethan cut in gently but with steel beneath. "You won't be alone, not out there, not in here." His hand made a small deliberate motion, a gesture Greer caught immediately. A silent nod passed between the two men, a wordless promise that had been spoken enough times in their shared history that no words were necessary. Marin looked between them and saw the same unyielding steadiness in both faces, and some of the tightness in her chest eased. It wasn't gone, never gone, but it loosened just enough for breath to come easier. She glanced back to her cup, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why it's always me they want." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it carried weight, years of unspoken truths they couldn't yet unravel. Greer's gaze softened fractionally from his post, Ethan's presence in the Force steady and warm against hers like a shield raised not in battle, but in quiet defiance of the shadows that stalked her. She didn't say more, and they didn't ask. They just stayed. 3 warriors who'd seen too much, bound by blood, battle, and the promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Alright. Welcome in, Soulless Alpha. Thank you for the follow. My name is Meshla. I am primarily an audiobook streamer. What that means for me is that I write and read Star Wars fanfiction, and I have been doing so for, oh my goodness, a lot longer than I care to think about. Let's just leave it at that. I also spend time doing writing workshops where we talk about various different aspects of writing stories and fanfiction in general. And I play Star Wars: The Old Republic. So welcome in, and I hope you enjoy the story tonight. The wait held in silence. The fire in the hearth had burned low, glowing embers casting a warm wash of light over the stone and timber walls of the hearthroom. Outside the windows, night had settled over the mountain estate. The air clear, the sky pricked with distant stars. The quiet here was different than aboard Valkyrie or any Marine barracks. It wasn't the tense, brittle quiet of military corridors, but the kind that carried old promises, a home that had seen both grief and shelter. Marin sat curled in one of the deep chairs near the fire, a cup of steaming bee-hot cups between her palms. She'd barely touched it, the rich, sweet scent rising from the cup doing little to ease the knots in her chest. Her hair, still slightly damp from washing the grime of travel and battlefield from her skin, clung in dark strands to her temple. Clean fatigues rested on her narrow frame, the name patch and rank stitched into place, but they couldn't quite hide how thin she seemed in the flickering light, or the way exhaustion sat like a weight across her shoulders. Ethan leaned against the stone arch of the doorway, his arms crossed loosely, his brown eyes steady on her. He hadn't said much since she sat down after dinner, letting her eat in silence, letting her hold the cup like it was the only thing tethering her. But now, as she hunched forward, staring into the fire, he finally moved. Crouching in front of her, his voice was quiet, calm, and edged with something softer than command. "Marin," he said. "Not Attica, not Kid, just her name. Steady and grounding. You've been carrying this too long. You need to let go, just for tonight." She swallowed hard, her throat working as if she might argue, but no words came out. Her fingers tightened on the cup instead, her knuckles blanching. Jared hovered near the far end of the hearth, silent but watchful, the faintest pull of the force from him keeping her from spiraling too far inward. He hadn't been on Vestine, but he'd seen the aftermath. He remembered the clearing on Tanagis. He remembered the broken shell they'd carried home 2 years ago and the months that had taken her to crawl out from that darkness. Seeing her now, pale under the firelight, it wasn't the same. But it was close. Too criffing close. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, catching Greer's eye. There were no words, just the faint twitch of his left index and middle finger near his knee, brushing along the seam of his trousers, a signal sharpened over decades of shared deployments. Hold the line. Nobody through. She needs this space tonight. Greer's chin dipped in the barest of nods, then he turned, his boots making no sound on the thick runner in the hall, and slipped out of the room. Outside, Greer didn't need to speak. One glance, a short hand motion, 2 fingers extended, palm down, and then a slow sweep outward, was all it took for Vec, Harris, and Rel to rise from where they'd been stationed along the hall. Quiet as race, they fanned out, moving to the outer perimeter of the estate. Each Marine knew what that signal meant. No interruptions, no stray visitors, no comms traffic. The Durza estate would be a fortress for the night, a wall of watchful silence around one exhausted young warrior who'd carried too much for too long. Back inside, Ethan rose and set a firm, warm hand on Marin's shoulder. "Time to get you to bed, Marika," he said, the Mandoa term of endearment slipping free like an unspoken vow. "I can walk," she murmured, even as she swayed slightly when she tried to rise. Jared moved before the cup even hit the table, stepped in close, his voice low. "Marin," he said, his blue eyes catching hers. "Let us help this time." Something in his tone, something she remembered from Mount Adon, from the clearing on Tanagis, from every moment he'd stayed close when she was too broken to ask, undid the last of her stubbornness. She nodded, barely, and let him take her weight. His arms were strong, steady, and careful as he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest like he had that first terrible night on Tanagis after Bastine. The only sound was the soft catch of her breath, the faint rasp of his boots on the stone floor as he carried her down the hall. Ethan followed, a silent shadow at their backs, every line of his body speaking the vow he'd made to Jarius long ago, that Marin would never walk alone into darkness again. Jared shouldered open the door to her room where Callista had turned on the blankets and left fresh sheets that smelled faintly of mountain air and sun-warmed linen. He lowered her carefully to the bunk, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary to make sure she was steady. Her fingers found Jarius's tags around her neck and clutched them tight as her head sank to the pillow. Ethan's presence filled the doorway, quiet and solid. "We've got you, Baltica," he murmured, his voice low, a promise meant for more than this one night. Jared eased back to sit on the edge of the bunk, his hand brushing her hair from her face. A faint shimmer of the force wrapping around her like a soft blanket. Not to bury anything, but to ease the jagged edges of memory, to let her breathe. Marin's eyes drifted closed at last, her body relaxing by inches as sleep claimed her safe under watch. Outside, Greer shifted position once more, silent as the night settling over the estate. His gaze swept the perimeter, his fingers tapping once against his thigh in wordless confirmation to the others. No one gets through. Not tonight. We have an ad starting in 3 minutes and 13 seconds. The mountain holds its breath. The mountain has always been a fortress, even before Jarius had claimed its stone halls as his own. Carved directly into the cliff face, the Durza estate didn't just look like part of the land, it was the land. Its foundations sunk deep into bedrock older than memory. Morning had only begun to touch the eastern sky, pale light creeping over distant ridges, but the mist still clung thick to the forests below, shifting with the faintest whisper of wind. Greer stood at the balcony's edge, his posture easy but his eyes sharp, the weight of old instincts never leaving him. The Veil shuttle had dropped them at the estate less than a rotation ago, its descent as silent and unmarked as the orders that had pulled them off Valkyrie. There had been no words exchanged on the trip down, none that weren't necessary. Not when the air still stank of Collier, of a trap that had almost taken Marin apart again. Not when every man aboard had felt the wrongness of the intel that had led them there, like a toxin buried under layers of official reports. He rolled his shoulders once, a quiet motion under the black utility jacket, his eyes tracking the mist below. He'd been here before. A different world, a different war zone, with the same gnawing unease. Bastine. 2 years passed, but the images never faded. The hell they'd pulled her out of was burned into him like a brand. The door, that cell creaking open under Ethan's hand, the air thick with the stink of blood and chemicals, the faint sound of her breathing ragged and shallow. Marin had been nothing but skin and bones, barefoot on cold durasteel, stripped of armor, stripped of name. Needle marks lined under her jaw and down her spine like someone had been mapping where to break her. He'd seen the color of her skin then, gray like ash, and thought for one awful second they'd come too late. It had taken Ethan lifting her, cradling her like something far too fragile for a battlefield, to make him believe that she was still alive. The image of her small slack form in Ethan's arms, carried to the Wurda in utter silence, was one that Greer would take to his grave. And every criffing time since, it was like watching echoes of that same moment. The clearing on Tanagis was almost a year ago. He hadn't been there for the fight, hadn't seen Jared scoop her up out of that blood-soaked dirt, but he'd seen the knees ruined, the stubborn struggle to walk again on legs that barely worked. Coruscant. He hadn't been there for the Ripper slugs, but he'd been there to see her shoulder bandaged, her left arm refusing to cooperate no matter how she masked it behind training discipline. Horriban. Again, the aftermath only. A broken wrist, her ribs bound tightly, every motion of fight just to get back to something resembling strength. He'd never stood in the middle of any of those battles with her, but he'd been there for the quiet after. Always on the periphery, never intruding because Veil Protocol demanded distance, but his oath to Jarius demanded vigilance. I will be right back, my friends. We're about to be in an ad break if we're not already. Get a drink of water. Alright, my friends, we are back from our ad break. Thanks so much for hanging around. I wish I could control the fact that we had those, but wait, I can't. So I'm glad you're still here. Let's go back to our chapter. And now, Collier. The pattern was undeniable. Each time they thought she was safe and that the veil would shield her, but bad intel had drawn her out again. Too precise, too tailored to where she'd be. It stank worse than the Deathwatch trench camp, and both Halloran and Dance had their hands on the chains somewhere. Greer couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, but every instinct screamed that one or both had led them into that meat grinder. He flexed his gloved hands on the stone railing, his jaw tight. Dance, especially. The man had been mapping Veil Protocol for months, learning where it flexed, where it cracked. And Halloran was somehow slipping poison into intel packets that should have been clean. If he'd known, if anyone had known that they were the same bastards tied to Bastine, he swallowed hard. They didn't. Not yet. And that ignorance gnawed at him as much as the memories did. Behind him, the estate was silent except for the faint sound of someone shifting in bed down the hall. Marin had barely stirred since they'd gotten her here. The sheets pulled soft and clean around her, Callista's touch making the room a haven instead of just four walls. The kid was sleeping the way she only ever did after being broken down to nothing. Deep, but tense, like her body feared it would be dragged awake into another nightmare. Jared hadn't moved from the space next to her bunk. Veil cleared or not, the boy looked like he'd sit there a lifetime if it meant she wouldn't wake alone. Vec drifted onto the balcony, his presence a shadow at Greer's shoulder. The two exchanged a glance, nothing more than a subtle shift of fingers on the railing, a half tilt of the head. Perimeter quiet, Theta 9 holding steady. Greer gave the smallest nod in return. For now. But they both knew it wasn't over. Not until they found the break in the chain. Not until whoever had marked Marin on Bastine, on Collier, maybe even long before either, was ripped out root and branch. Until then, this mountain would hold, the estate would hold, and so would they, even if it meant standing watch forever. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 10. Alright. Gonna get myself some water. Chapter 11. The slow return of light. A fragile morning. The mountain woke slowly, the way it always had. Outside the thick stone walls, dawn had not yet bled over the jagged line of the eastern peaks. The forest far below was still heavy with mist, its quiet broken only by the distant rush of water from the glacial streams carving their way down towards the valley. Within the Dursa estate, silence held like a living thing, the kind born not of emptiness but of deliberate, respectful stillness. Marin stirred faintly, a slow, restless motion under the soft, clean sheets that had been tucked so carefully around her the night before. Her breath caught once, a slight hitch like the echo of something remembered, but she didn't wake fully. She drifted in that fragile place between sleep and awareness, her body still recovering from Collier's brutal mark. Even here, in her own room, in the safety of her father's home carved into the mountain's heart, her muscles carried tension like an old friend. Jared hadn't left her side all night. The bunk wasn't large, but that hadn't stopped him from settling close the way he had after Bastine, after Korriban, after the clearing on Tanagis. Back then, he'd sat awake for hours on the floor or beside her bunk, refusing to move until he knew she'd finally slept without flinching. Here, he'd chosen the floor at first, his knees drawn up, his back against the bed frame. At some point in the long stretch of night, he'd shifted, tucking in behind her on the narrow bunk, not touching, not crowding, just there. A quiet, solid presence, his warmth a shield between her and whatever ghost might try to creep in through the cracks. Even in sleep, Jared radiated that stubborn, wordless vow he'd made long ago. The one he never spoke aloud, but that lived in every action. Not again. Not while I'm breathing. Outside her door, Greer stood like a part of the mountain itself. The Master Sergeant hadn't sat down once in the hour since they'd returned. His arms folded loosely across his chest, his boots planted in a way that said he could move in half a heartbeat. His stance was a silent warning to anyone or anything who might dare disturb the peace of this corridor. Vec had taken the late watch on the perimeter with Harris and Raul. The rotations staggered so eyes were always on the approaches to the estate. But Greer had claimed this post himself. He remembered Bastine too clearly not to. The smell of the cell, the sight of her feet hanging limp as Ethan carried her, the little sound she'd made, a choked, involuntary noise that wasn't even a word, when the wordless hatch had closed behind them and the safety was finally real. Greer had sworn then that if there was anything he could do to keep her from ever reaching that point again, he'd do it. The oath had been silent, known only to him, to Jarius' memory, and maybe to Ethan, but it was carved deep enough to never break. Now, leaning against the stone wall outside her room, the weight of his rifle familiar against his chest, he let his gaze drift to the carved wooden door. The estate's quiet was deceptive. This wasn't peace. This was the aftermath. The kind of silence that comes only after someone has survived something meant to end them, and Greer had lived through enough aftermaths to recognize how fragile it really was. Inside, Marin shifted again, her breath quickening for a moment as though some flicker of memory tried to drag her from the thin thread of sleep. Jared stirred immediately, the faint sound of his sleeve against the sheets barely audible as he shifted closer. Not touching, but there, anchoring. A soft pulse through the force, nothing invasive, just a quiet weight like a hand on her shoulder. told her, even half asleep, that she wasn't alone. Her breathing evened out again. Jared exhaled slowly, his head tipping back against the wall, his own eyes closing once more. Sleep came to him reluctantly, in shallow snatches, but he'd learned long ago that rest wasn't about how deep it went. It was about being there when he was needed. The mountains held its breath around them, its carved stone walls wrapping this quiet sanctuary like a fortress. Outside, the first hint of sunlight began to touch the peaks. Down the hall, a kettle clicked softly as someone, Callista probably, started a fresh pot of bee-hot in the kitchen for when Marin woke. The scent would drift this way soon, warm and grounding, another tether to the present. For now, though, the only sounds were the slow rhythm of Marin's breathing, the faint rustle of Jared's cloak as he shifted to keep her safe in his orbit, and the quiet presence of Greer just beyond the door. A Marine who had seen too much to trust the silence, but would hold it for her as long as she needed. The weight of gentle hands. The hearthroom was warm already, though dawn hadn't yet fully broken over the mountains. Golden light from the fire danced along the stone walls, its glow softened by the rich wood paneling and the tapestry hanging near the long table. The windows looked out over the mist-draped peaks, where the first rays of sunlight bled pale and uncertain through the high forest canopy. The air carried a subtle blend of mountain pine, old stone, and the faint sweetness of fresh bread warming in the oven. It was a kind of peace Marin rarely knew anymore. A quiet that was unforced, unguarded, yet still wrapped in the faint tension of the men who had carried her home and remained close. Jared was the first thing she felt when she woke, steady, solid, a warm presence anchoring her to the here and now. He'd been there all night, a barrier between her and the darker edges of her memories. When she stirred, blinking against the pale light seeping through the curtains, his gaze was already on her. Not heavy, not full of pity, just a quiet check-in. "You awake?" he asked softly, his voice low so it wouldn't cut the fragile morning calm. Marin swallowed hard, the weight of sleep clinging to her, and gave the smallest nod. "Yeah," she murmured, though her voice was rough, as if the word had scraped past something heavy in her chest. She shifted, testing the soreness in her muscles. Even after Bacta, there was stiffness where fire had lit her arms and neck, where electricity had burned its way beneath her armor. The linen of her sleep tunic was soft against it, a deliberate choice from Callista last night, but every motion still reminded her of Collier. Jared moved slowly, careful not to startle or crowd her. "Breakfast's on. You think you can make it to the hearthroom?" Marin drew in a long breath, let it out, and gave another faint nod. "I can try." Her voice was steadier this time, even if she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. She shifted to sit on the edge of the bed slowly, her bare feet brushing the cool wood floor, and gritted her teeth at the pull in her side protested the moment. Jared was beside her in an instant, offering his arm. Not hovering, not commanding, just there if she wanted it. She glanced at him and saw the quiet patience in his blue eyes, and wordlessly slid her fingers into the crook of his elbow, leaning more of her weight on him than she'd like. The hallway beyond her room was hushed. Greer straightened from where he'd been standing sentry, his expression unreadable, but his eyes tracking every nuance of her posture. He didn't say anything. He just shifted half a step behind them as they moved down the corridor. His presence wasn't heavy, but it was unmistakable. The kind of watchfulness born from knowing too well how fragile someone could be after being dragged back from Sirenthal. For those who might not know, that is the Atashir word for help. You're welcome. That's your vocabulary word for the day. Atashir is a language that I have actually created. It is both the spoken and written language of the planet that I created for my stories called Catan, and also Tanagis 5. Yeah, so if you'd like to learn more about any of that, please feel free to ask in chat. They reached the hearthroom slowly. The scent of bread and warm bee-hot wrapped around Marin the moment they stepped in, grounding her in something that wasn't smoke and blaster fire. Callista was already there, standing near the long table with a mug in her hands, her blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders, silver streaks catching the firelight. Her blue eyes lifted the moment she heard them, scanning Marin in one sweep that was part healer's instinct, part mother's worry. "Marika," Callista said softly, setting her mug aside and crossing the room without haste but with purpose. "You should still be resting." "I've rested enough," Marin whispered, though even to her own ears the word lacked conviction. She sank carefully into one of the cushioned chairs near the fire, still holding onto Jared's hand for balance until he let go only when she was steady. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, chasing some of the chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Callista crouched in front of her, scanning the cuts that lined her face. The Bacta had done its work. The angry red lines were fading to pale pink, but the shadows under Marin's eyes were dark. "You've rested," Callista said gently, "but you've not healed yet." Her voice carried no judgment, only a quiet truth. She reached out, lightly brushing a strand of dark hair back from Marin's temple, her touch feather light where burns still lingered on her neck and face. Marin closed her eyes briefly, the simple gesture unraveling something tight inside her chest. "I just didn't want to lie there anymore," she admitted, her voice low. "I keep seeing her face. I hear the crack of lightning in my ears. I can't." She trailed off, swallowing hard. Jared moved to sit beside her, his hand finding hers under the edge of the table. Wheezing once. "You don't have to say it," he murmured. "We know." One second. Okay. Alrighty. Greer had remained a few paces away, leaning against the stone archway where he could watch both Marin and the door to the hall. At her words, his eyes softened fractionally, but his expression remained steady, a silent wall of support. Callista gave Marin a look that was both tender and firm. "Then let it out here, not in the dark of your room," she said, nodding toward the table where a steaming mug of behot and a small plate of food waited. "Eat a little, drink something warm, let yourself feel the ground under your feet. You're home now, Marika, for as long as you need to be." Marin's breath hitched, but she nodded. Jared helped slide the plate closer, his other hand never leaving hers, as if he could anchor her there with sheer presence. She picked up the mug first, wrapping her free hand around it as the heat seeped into her fingers. "Thank you," she murmured, looking between them, Callista, Jared, and Greer standing silent sentinel in the doorway. For a moment, the firelight flickered over their faces, turning the moment into something carved out of time, fragile and unshakable all at once. Here, in the heart of the mountain, she could finally breathe without smoke filling her lungs. The weight of old shadows. The mountain air was sharp in the lungs that morning, cool and heavy with the scent of pine and damp stone. The clouds dragged low along the jagged ridgelines above the estate, shrouding the upper spires in shifting mist. The expansive landing terrace below the main entrance was usually quiet, a place where only the occasional Veil shuttle touched down. Today, the silence was fractured by the low, steady hum of a speeder cresting the last rise of the trail. Marin Werda leaned low over the controls as he approached. His visor darkened against the dawn glare, and his dark, mottled green armor dulled by dust from the long run-up from the southern colony. He rode like a man who'd spent years on edge, balanced, wary, every shift of his hands on the controls taut with restrained tension. He'd received the Veil-encrypted message late the night before. No names, just the seal and the clearance string that had left no doubt in his mind. Theta 9 injured. Come quietly. No delays. The speeder came to a growling halt on the stone terrace. He swung off with the same fluid motion he used on patrol, helmet in one hand, his dark hair tugged loose by the wind, sharp green eyes already scanning the terrain and the high ridges like he was expecting old ghosts to come stalking out of the trees. He'd learned long ago that Death Watch didn't stop hunting their prey just because the stars said it was morning. Greer was waiting in the shadow of the landing steps, a broad figure in plain black fatigues, his arms folded, his eyes as watchful as ever. There was no salute, no formal greeting, just a meeting of gazes and a single nod, old soldiers acknowledging what neither wanted to say aloud. "Where is she?" Aran's voice was quiet, roughened by the ride and something harder beneath it. "Inside," Greer replied, matching his tone. He jerked his chin toward the main entrance, a silent understanding of why Aran had come. "She's resting. Ethan's with her. Jared, too." Aran's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the heavy doors. "She was fine when I saw her last," he muttered, though it was more to himself than Greer. Clearing on Tanagis damn near cost her knees. Horrorman broke her ribs and wrist, and now this. He hissed the last word like it tasted of ash. His green eyes lifted, pinning Greer where he stood. "How bad?" Greer's silence was his own answer for a long beat, broken only by the sighing wind. Then, voice low, "Bad enough that you were called." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Death Watch, 30 of them. Trained force user among them. Whoever fed us the intel wanted Theta 9 in the open. She walked out on her feet, but it wasn't clean." The younger man swore under his breath. The words sharp in Mendoa and dragged a gauntleted hand through his dark hair. "They're escalating," he said finally, quieter now. Horrorban wasn't enough. Bestine wasn't enough. The clearing wasn't enough. He glanced back toward his speeder, anger vibrating in his stance. "I left those criffing lunatics for a reason, and this is exactly why." Greer studied him, weighing something, and then gave the barest tilt of his head toward the door. "She'll want to see you." There was a faint pause. "But don't push her. Valkyrie's medics did their job. Ethan's making sure she eats and rests." His voice went flat. A Marine's warning edge threaded through it. "She needs time." Aran nodded once, sharp and certain, even as the frustration flickered in his eyes. "I won't push." He hesitated, and then met Greer's gaze fully, speaking quieter still. "If I'd been there." He let it trail off, a promise and a regret wrapped in one breath. Greer's reply was a single, iron-threaded statement. "We were there," meaning he, Beck, Harris, and Ral, and they still came too close to losing her. The silence that followed was heavier than the mist clinging to the mountain. Finally, Aran drew a long breath, clipping his helmet to his belt, and following Greer up the stone steps. The halls inside were hewn directly from the mountain, lit softly with sconces that burned low and warm. The Durza estate had a quiet weight to it, the kind that sank into your bones if you stayed long enough. They reached the smaller sitting room near Marin's room, where Ethan stood by the fire with Jared nearby, his posture tight but calm, the way Jedi learned to be even when worry gnawed at them. Marin sat curled on the long bench beside the hearth, a linen tunic draped softly over her healing burns, her dark hair pulled back loosely. Jarius' tags wound through her fingers like a lifeline. She looked up as the door eased open. For a long moment, her blue eyes widened, and something fragile flickered across her face. Relief? Gratitude? The kind of warmth that only came from knowing someone had chosen to come when you needed them most. "Aran," she breathed, her voice soft and rough-edged from too many days holding it all in. He crossed the room in 2 strides, crouching beside her like the older brother he'd become, his green eyes scanning her face and every line of her posture for what pain lingered. "You're a mess." he said quietly, a rough attempt at levity that didn't hide the rasp in his voice. What in all nine Sith hells did they throw at you this time? Her gaze faltered, a shadow passing across her face. Collier, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Intel said pirates. We hit the ground. It was Kirt-Sod, 30 of them, and one of theirs. Her hand tightened on the tags, her breath uneven. She was trained, Aran, not just a brute with a blade, force-trained. She knew how to hurt. Marin's free hand curled slightly in her lap as if remembering the lightning that had torn through her body. She went straight for me. We have an ad starting in 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Something dark burned in his green eyes at that, old rage he'd buried under layers of new purpose. He glanced toward Ethan and Jared, reading the set of their shoulders, the silent exchange of understanding that passed between them, and then leaned closer to Marin, his voice firm but quiet, just for her. You're still here, he said, his hand settling gently over hers where it gripped the tags. That's what matters right now. The rest, we'll get there. I'm not letting them take another shot at you, not while I'm breathing. Marin swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest, some of the tension bleeding from her posture. For a few heartbeats, no one spoke. The only sound, the quiet crackle of the hearth fire and the distant sigh of the mountain wind. In that silence, old bonds forged in blood and fire reknit themselves. Not just promises, but an unspoken oath renewed. Whatever shadows still hunted Marin Durza, they would have to pass through all of them to reach her again. Silent strategy. The war room was a cavern carved directly into the heart of the mountain, its walls hewn smooth and reinforced with durasteel ribs. A single hollow table sat at its center, projecting the Tanagis system in muted blue, its glow the only harsh light in the otherwise dimly lit chamber. The space had been Jarius's once, designed for quiet planning far from the eyes of the wider galaxy. Now it was his daughter's refuge, a place where they could speak beneath the veil, out of reach of anyone not cleared to know she was alive. Ethan stood at the head of the table, broad-shouldered, his arms folded, the faint silver in his hair catching the hollow light. Greer and Vec were posted near the door, silent sentinels, every movement measured. Aran leaned forward on the table's edge, one hand flat against the steel as he studied the faintly spinning projection. His green eyes bright but shadowed, a predator forced into stillness. Jared had taken a position just off to the side, standing at quiet attention, his presence steady as the mountain itself. Ethan broke the silence first, his voice low, deliberate, every syllable weighted. 3 times now. His brown eyes tracked the projected coordinates of Collier, then Bastine, and then the clearing on Tanagis, a triangle of pain that should never have happened. 3 times they've drawn her out. 3 times it's nearly cost her life. Different planets, different years, same smell to the intel. His jaw tightened, the muscle flexing hard. And someone wants us to think that it's chance. Aran let out a sharp breath, shaking his head firmly. There's nothing to chance about Kirt-Sod. They don't hunt blind. Someone fed your Marines false leads, knowing she'd be on that op. His fingers curled into a fist on the table. I spent enough years running with those Jakari to know their tactics. They don't just ambush, they stalk. And they stalk until they break you. His gaze lifted, meeting Ethan's directly, and someone in uniform is giving them the means to do it. Greer's voice came like gravel over durasteel, quiet but cutting. Halloran was on Collier, so was Dance. He didn't move. He didn't blink, but his eyes held the same unshaken weight they had the night they pulled Marin from Bastine. We don't have proof, but they're always too close when things go wrong. It smells wrong. It always has. His gaze flicked to Ethan. You know it. Ethan didn't deny it. I know it, he said flatly, his voice like a blade dragged across stone. but knowing and proving are two different things. Connors won't burn them without hard evidence, and we don't have it. Yet. His gaze swept to Greer, a single subtle signal in the flicker of his fingers against his forearm. A silent code that the Marines knew well. Watch. Don't move too soon. Greer's chin dipped in the barest acknowledgement, and I am going to stop right there because we're about to be in an ad, my friends. Catch you in a minute and a half. All right, my friends, we are back from our ad break. I hope you took that time to go get yourselves a snack, a drink, or take a gentle stretch. Those are all important things to do and to take care of yourself. Get back to our chapter. Jared shifted slightly, breaking his silence for the first time. If they know where she is every time, he hesitated, his young face hard but certain. Then we're compromised already. How do we keep her safe when we don't know who's feeding them information? Ethan's gaze flicked to him, softened for only a breath before hardening again. By doing what we do best, he said, his voice low but steady. We keep her close. We keep the veil tight. We make no moves that aren't ghosted 6 ways to Daryaim. And when the next leak comes... He leaned forward, planting both hands on the table, every line of his posture radiating lethal intent. We follow it, quietly, all the way back to the swords. Aren straightened, crossing his arms, the old Death Watch bitterness in his tone like acid. And when we get there, we put them down, because they won't stop. Yurt-Saw doesn't stop until you make them. His green eyes cut to Ethan, fierce and unflinching. I didn't drag myself out of that Daryaim just to watch them do worse to her than they did to me. What they did to others. Greer's voice came like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. We'll have our chance, but not yet. He glanced at Ethan, silent code flashing between them again. We move only when Connors gives the word. And then aloud. Until then, we lock this place down. No one outside veil clearance gets near her. Not Halloran, not Dance, no one. Ethan nodded once, sharply, turning his gaze to Vec. Titan patrols, double watches. I don't care if this mountain sleeps, nothing moves outside this estate unless one of us says so. Vec's answering nod was wordless, his fingers already tapping a quiet rhythm against his wrist, a code that Greer translated instantly. Ral and Harris are already on the perimeter. No gaps. Aran looked back to the table, to the faint glow of Collier's coordinates, his jaw hardening. She's tougher than any of us give her credit for, he said, his voice quieter now, a glimmer of pride under the grit. But you keep throwing her into fire like this. His fist clenched, then slowly opened, raw restraint in every motion. Even steel cracks. Ethan's brown eyes met his green, calm but with the weight of years behind them. She's not steel, he said softly. She's Jerry's daughter, and that means she doesn't break. A pause, a breath that sounded almost like an oath. Not while we're here to hold the line. The silence that followed was thick, full of shared understanding and quiet rage. These men had seen enough, done enough, to know exactly what they were up against. They couldn't stop the storm coming yet, but they could stand together, shoulder to shoulder, in the path of it until the day they had their proof. And when that day came, someone in uniform would learn what it truly meant to cross a Marine, a Jedi, and the family they had sworn long ago to protect. Shadows of memory. The quiet of the estate felt older than the stone it was carved from. Narrow wall sconces cast muted amber light along the guest wing's hallway, soft enough not to startle a resting mind, but bright enough to catch on the edges of old ironwood trim and the faint sheen of polished floors. Beyond the windows, the mountain's night air rolled cold and steady, bringing with it the smell of pine and rain that never quite reached this high up the cliffs. The silence here was intentional, layered, a choice forged by years of keeping vigil, of carrying the weight of ghosts without letting them drown the living. Jared walked at an unhurried pace, his boots quiet on the stone. He carried the stillness the way only someone who'd learned to listen to it could, measured in every step and in the way his eyes lingered on every shadowed corner of the corridor. Beside him, Aran moved with the coiled watchfulness of a man who'd once lived by instinct alone, his armor plates dull mottled green under the low light. He'd removed his helmet, letting the air touch his face, the sharp lens of his jaw shadowed under short, dark hair. His green eyes were alert, but the longer they walked in silence, the more something unreadable settled behind them. An old memory, half buried but still sharp. Jared broke the silence first, his voice low and deliberate, like a man pulling truth from deep water. She told me a little, he said, about Bestine. Not much, just enough to know that it wasn't just a prison. He glanced at Aran, the lamplight catching on his pale hair, his jaw tight. But sometimes, when she sleeps, I see more. He hesitated, letting the words breathe. Fragments. Things I wish I didn't know. Aran didn't answer at once. He slowed slightly, his boots dragging over the polished stone, his gaze fixed ahead on the dark wood door that marked the guest room prepared for him. His shoulders tightened under the mottled green armor, the old Death Watch insignia long scorched away, but never forgotten. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a roughness that time hadn't dulled. You saw the needles, didn't you? His tone was flat, not accusing, but certain, under her jaw, along the spine. Jared's silence was answer enough. Aran exhaled through his nose, a long, steady breath that sounded like someone fighting an old war all over again. The old hands, he muttered, bitterness in every syllable. That technique should have died 100 years ago, should have been burned from the stars. He raked a hand through his hair, his fingers curling briefly into a fist before he dropped it again. We used to tell ourselves that it was only stories, that even the worst of us didn't go that far anymore. His jaw clenched hard enough to make the tendon stand out. We lied. Jared's steps slowed, and for a moment he just watched Aran. He felt it. Not through the force, but through the quiet that threaded between them, an unspoken recognition of shared fury and helplessness alike. She doesn't talk about it, he said softly. Not really. Just that it happened, that Ethan and Greer brought her out. His hand flexed at his side as though resisting the urge to reach for a saber that wasn't needed here. But she dreams like it's still happening, like she's still locked in there. Aran had stopped walking altogether, turning to face Jared, his green eyes lit with something sharp. Because part of her is. His voice was low and tight with anger he wasn't trying to hide anymore. You don't come back clean from something like that. They don't just take your strength. They take your choice. Every time you breathe afterward, part of you wonders if it's yours or theirs. He swore quietly in Mandoa, the old words edged with grief. She's tougher than anyone I've met, but that kind of scar doesn't fade. It just learns to live quietly. Jared met his gaze steadily, his own voice barely above a whisper. I carried her out of the clearing on Tanagis. Broken knees. She couldn't stand on her own. Korriban, we both saw what that cost her. I thought I understood pain before. He shook his head slowly. But whatever they did to her on Bestine, that's different. It's like it rewrote the air around her. Aran's expression softened just enough to show the man beneath the armor, the one Marin had seen just weeks before her trials, when she'd reached past his Deathwatch colors and offered a second chance. I told her once, he said, his voice quieter now, that I'd help her keep the dark off her back. It didn't matter how much blood was already on mine. When I saw her on Korriban fighting through broken ribs and a wrecked wrist just to get Renius out, I knew she wasn't going to stop for anyone, but I swore I'd try to make sure she didn't have to do it alone ever again. Jared drew a slow breath, nodding once like the words anchored something deep inside him. She's got us now, he said. Both of us. Whatever comes next, we stand for her. A beat of silence passed between them, heavy and full of meaning. They won't touch her again. Aran's mouth tugged into something like a grim smile. Not joy, not relief, but agreement forged in fire. No, he said, his voice iron. They won't. They reached the door to the guest room. Neither moved to open it immediately. The air between them carried too much weight, the kind that didn't vanish with words. Finally, Aran reached out, resting a calloused hand on Jared's shoulder, firm and deliberate, the way soldiers share a vow. You keep that promise, he said. I will too. Jared met his eyes, steady and unflinching. Always. And in the quiet that followed, no further words were needed. Two men, both shaped by shadow, stood in the silent oath beneath the mountain roof of Marin's home. Whatever ghost lingered from Bestine or Tanagis or even Korriban, they would bear them together, and no veil or shadow in the galaxy would take her without going through them first. I'm gonna get myself some water. Morning over the ridge. The mountain air was cool this morning, sharp enough to sting when Marin drew her first breath beyond sleep. The light filtering in through the balcony doors was pale gold, cutting soft lines across the stone floor of her room. It was quieter than she expected, save for the faint rustle of leaves from the high pines outside and the distant whisper of a mountain stream making its way down toward the valley. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, her fingers curled loosely around Jairus' tags, letting their familiar weight anchor her. The pain in her ribs and neck had dulled to a deep ache, made more tolerable by the long hours of rest the last 2 days had forced upon her. But it wasn't just her body that felt fragile. Something inside her was still trying to knit itself back together, just out of reach. She tugged on the soft linen tunic and pants folded over the chair at her bedside and shrugged a light blanket around her shoulders before moving to the balcony doors. Her bare feet were silent on the stone, the coolness of it grounding her as she eased the doors open and stepped outside. The mountain wind met her instantly, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and a hint of smoke from last night's hearth fire. She let it wash over her, closing her eyes for a heartbeat before opening them to the vast sweep of the valley below. The sun had just begun to crest over the distant peaks, spilling light over ridges still misted from dawn rain. Jared was already there, seated cross-legged on the balcony near the railing, a small portable heater beside him with a battered tin pot resting on top. The faint, familiar scent of bee-hot leaves steeping in water wound through the cool air, comforting it in its simplicity. He glanced over at his shoulder as she came out, his blue eyes quiet and steady. "You should be resting," he said softly. Not a reprimand, more of a quiet observation. His voice held the same gentleness he'd used on the worst nights after Bastille, when sleep had been impossible, and the only thing keeping her grounded had been the quiet presence of a friend who'd never pressed for words. "I've done little else," Marin murmured, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. "If I stayed in that bed any longer, I think I'd start growing roots." She sank down beside him, her legs folding awkwardly beneath her, and winced as her body protested. Jared noticed, but only offered her the mug he'd already poured, steam curling up between them. She accepted it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers before lifting it to breathe in the herbal scent. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jared nodded once, his gaze drifting out toward the ridgeline beyond the balcony. For a while, they simply sat there, listening to the world awake. The quiet hum of the heater, the occasional cry of a distant bird, the steady rhythm of their breathing. It felt almost like safety, something Marin hadn't known the feel of it in too long. After several minutes, Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, his boots making little sound on the stone. He looked older in the morning light. Lines more pronounced around his eyes, but the set of his shoulders was as strong as ever. He carried his own mug of bee-hot, cradled in his weathered hands, and leaned against the railing, watching the sun climb higher. "You're up early," he said, glancing at Marin, his voice a quiet rumble that always made her think of long marches across Tanagis and whispered lessons under starlight. Or late, depending on how you look at it. "I couldn't sleep," Marin admitted, her thumb rubbing over the engraved letters on Jerry's tags. She didn't bother to hide the gesture, both men knew her well enough to understand. Ethan's gaze softened, a flicker of pain there as he looked at the tags and then at her. "Some wounds don't heal on a clock," he said after a moment. "It doesn't matter how many battles you've fought, the ones inside." He shook his head faintly, letting the words trail off. Marin stared into her mug, steam curling up like ghosted memories she couldn't quite chase away. "It feels like every time I think I've learned to stand on my own feet, something comes along and proves that I haven't," she whispered. "Bastille, Coruscant, Korriban, and now Collier. It feels like they're all just waiting for me to trip." Jared shifted slightly, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The contact was small, deliberate, a grounding presence that reminded her she wasn't alone, as alone as she thought. "Standing doesn't mean you don't stumble," he said softly, "only that you keep getting back up." She glanced at him, caught by the quiet conviction in his eyes. They'd both known pain, loss, and moments where survival was the only victory. But Jared's voice never carried pity, only a quiet, stubborn belief that she was stronger than she thought. Ethan took a slow sip from his mug before speaking again. "You don't have to carry this alone, Marin," he said, and there was weight in the way that he used her name, an anchor against the storm she kept trying to weather by herself. "Your father tried that once. So did I. It's a hard road, and it doesn't end well." Marin swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She tightened her grip on the mug and nodded, not quite trusting her voice. The sun was fully up now, casting light over the estate's stone terraces, the mountains beyond glowing with the dawn. For just a moment, the world fell still. Jared finally broke the silence, a hint of dry humor softening the edge of the morning's weight. You know, if Greer finds out you've been out here in the cold this long, he'll have my head for not hauling you back inside. That earned the faintest smile from Marin, the first of the morning. I'll take the blame, she murmured, leaning slightly into his shoulder. He's already decided I'm a lost cause when it comes to following orders about resting. Ethan's lips twitched, something like approval in his eyes. He's not wrong, he said, pushing off the railing and heading for the door. Finish your beehot, then we'll see about some real food before Callista hunts you down. Marin let out a soft breath, tension easing just a little as she watched him go. She turned her gaze back to the mountains, clutching the mug like it was the only thing tethering her to the present. I wish it could always be this quiet, she whispered, not sure if she meant for anyone to hear. Jared didn't reply, but his hands shifted, brushing hers briefly before settling on the railing beside her. The gesture said enough. Whatever came next, however loud and brutal the galaxy became again, this moment, the mountains, the quiet, few men who refused to leave her side, was hers to keep. I don't know why I keep slouching. Echoes of a blade. The sun had risen high enough to warm the mountain air, spilling pale light across the slate stones of the courtyard. The estate's training circle, a wide ring of dark stone carved directly into the mountain's terrace, had stood unused for weeks. The dust of quiet days lingered at the edges, disturbed only by the breeze and the occasional scrape of leaves blown across its surface. Today, it felt different, expectant, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Marin stood just inside the circle, her linen sleepwear traded for a loose set of training clothes. A soft gray tunic and dark trousers that wouldn't catch on the raw patches of healing skin along her arms and legs. Her bare feet were braced against the stone to ground her stance. Darius's tags hung at her collarbone, the metal warmed by the morning sun, an anchor she clung to as much as the faint scent of pine carried on the breeze. Jared was a few steps away, his own training attire worn in and comfortable, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes tracked every shift in her stance, every hint of strain in her shoulders. He knew her tells too well. The subtle twitch when her ribs pulled, the way she still favored her left leg despite trying to mask it. Before either of them spoke, Callista's quiet footfalls approached, soft swish of her deep blue and silver robes blending with the mountain breeze. She carried no saber, no medkit, only the calm weight of presence that had been a lifeline more times than Marin could count. Before you even think of picking up that blade, Callista said softly, stepping into the circle, we're going to make sure you aren't about to tear half-healed muscle or worse. Her tone was gentle, but left no room for argument. Marin glanced down, a faint flush of guilt creeping up her neck, but she didn't protest. The quiet sounds of the courtyard filled the silence as Callista moved closer, her hands hovering just above Marin's ribs before pressing lightly in a few places. Marin hissed when Callista's fingers found a particularly tender spot on her right side. Still bruised, Callista murmured, her gaze flicking briefly to Jared. And your burns? Mostly healed, Marin said, her voice low. She tugged the loose sleeve of her tunic up to show the pale, mottled new skin on her forearm. It's still tender. Callista's blue eyes softened, though worry still lingered. Tender means you take this slow, she said firmly, before brushing a stray lock of blonde hair streaked with silver back behind your ear. You push too hard and you'll undo everything the back has done for you. Understood? Understood, Marin murmured, glancing at Jared for the briefest moment. He caught her look and offered a small nod, reassuring and steady. We'll keep it light, he promised, his voice a quiet counterpoint to Callista's sharper tone. Just movement, no blades yet. Callista lingered a moment longer, studying Marin's face, the lines of exhaustion still present under her eyes despite the hours of rest. "I'll let you have this," she said softly, "but if you falter, you stop." A hand came up, cupping Marin's cheek briefly, warm, and unspoken love in the touch. "Your worth is not measured by how quickly you get back up, Marika." Marin swallowed hard, the old weight of expectation pressing against her chest for an instant before easing under Callista's words. "I know," she whispered, but it sounded more like a promise to try than full belief. We have an ad starting in 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Give me just a moment. Okay. When Callista finally stepped back, Jared motioned for Marin to follow his lead. They began with breathing, a rhythm they both knew from their years in the Praxium. Inhale for 4, hold, exhale for 6, again, and again. Slowly, the tightness in Marin's chest eased, her heartbeat syncing with the count that Jared murmured under his breath. Then came the stretches. Jared demonstrated each one first, deliberately and slow, waiting until Marin mirrored his movements before continuing. Every shift of muscle was measured and cautious. When she winced, he adjusted the angle, offering quiet instructions. "Ease into it. Don't force it. Let the motion do the work for you." Minutes passed like this, the air filled only with their breathing, the soft scuff of bare feet on stone, the occasional distant call of a hawk circling above the mountain. Gradually, Marin's body began to loosen, some of the stiffness melting away, though the ache lingered, a reminder that she was not whole yet. Jared crouched near her as she straightened from a deep stretch, his blue eyes meeting hers with the flicker of something unspoken. Concern, yes, but also understanding. "You don't have to prove anything here," he said quietly. Words meant only for her. Not to me, not to anyone. Marin looked away, her jaw tightening as she fought to keep the memories of Collier, Bastine, and the clearing from clawing their way forward. "I know," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying the weight of ghosts that didn't let go. Jared reached out, briefly laying his hand over hers and grounding her in the present. "One breath at a time," he murmured. "One step at a time. We'll get there." For the first time since stepping into the circle, Marin allowed herself to breathe fully, to let the mountain air fill her lungs without the shadow of panic close behind it. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Jared's quiet smile said enough. This wasn't about combat today. It was about reclaiming the ground beneath her feet, one careful stretch, one steady breath, one fragile piece of self returned to her keeping. Silent perimeter. The mountain night was cool and sharp, the wind skimming off the jagged peaks and whispering through the tall ironwood trees surrounding the Durza estate. Shadows stretched long under the twin moons, spilling across the stone terraces and narrow switchback paths leading to the estate's lower approaches. Even in the quiet, the estate did not sleep, not fully. Not while Marines held watch under veil orders, every step of their patrol carved from silent duty and memory that refused to fade. Beck crouched near the western overlook, one knee pressed to the stone as he adjusted a low-light sensor beacon, its glow faint enough not to give away a position. From here, he could see the faint glimmer of the southern forest canopy under starlight and the dark ribbon of the access road that wound up from the valley below. Harris's silhouette moved steadily along the lower perimeter, his rifle slung loose but ready. Every few paces, he was pausing to scan the tree line with practiced precision. Further out, Ral's soft whistle, a single rising note threaded through the wind. All clear on his vector. Greer stepped up beside Vec, his boots rolling silently on the rock. His presence weighted heavier than the night air. He scanned the valley without a word, his hands folded behind his back. Every line of his posture carved in old habits honed since Bastine. Finally, his fingers tapped twice against his forearm, a silent question. "All layers secure?" Vet gave a small, precise nod, responding with the same silent code. Western bridge tight, hair is set, Rel's eyes on the far side. He hesitated only a breath before his last gesture, a flicker of 2 fingers angled upward toward the estate's highest window where a faint light still glowed. Theta 9, resting. And I'm going to stop right there because we have an ad in less than 10 seconds. Please take this 1.5-minute ad break to get yourself some water, stretch, get a snack, or take your meds if you need to do that. I will see you guys back here very shortly. Daz, welcome in. So good to see you. You didn't miss the stream, not all of it. I'm actually finishing the last few paragraphs. I'd say like the last actually on the last page. No, the last couple of pages. But no. The last 3 pages. You didn't miss you didn't miss it. I'm on the last 3 pages of the chapter. Well, I appreciate it, and thank you so much for the subscription again. I appreciate you. Never required, but much appreciated when you can. Especially that Prime subscription, because you only ever get one of those. So I very much appreciate it. Alright. So we are... I know, it's like super easy. So it's pretty awesome. We are finishing the last 3 pages of chapter 11 called The Slow Return of Light. I really wish that you had been here last week and the week before, because we have actually... Hey, I appreciate you, and the fact that I am on your short list of subscriptions, that means a lot to me. No, it's fine! It's fine, that's what VODs are for. They're always up on YouTube. So, if anybody is interested in watching the VODs from the last couple of streams, please do so. They can be found here on my Twitch for the next couple of weeks, but they're always exported to YouTube as well, so you can always find them. Last stream we talked about give me a second. Ah, yes. Last stream we actually took these 2 chapters and we talked about writing recovery in stories, whether you're writing a actual like novel for publishing or whether you're writing fan fiction. So recovery writing and also the reclaiming of agency, which if you're recovering from being sick or injured or something like that, that's a really important step in recovery. So I really wanted to take the time to talk about that as it relates to my stories and just kind of life in general. And then yes. Well, awesome. Maybe I'll pick your brain. And then the stream the week before that, we talked about my writing process actually. So we spent a couple of hours talking about that. Yes, that's awesome. So helpful. I really think that self-care is super important. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to spend the stream last week talking about recovery and reclaiming of agency, because you know, not only as it relates to self-care, but also like as it relates to the people around you who might be helping take care of you, so that you can reclaim your agency and your sense of self without feeling like a burden or like you're pushing too hard. So I think that was a really, really important discussion that we had. So would love to hear your thoughts on that stream in particular. Yes. I try. Yes. That's why we're here. Because I care about you guys. Oh, did you really? Like, so this is actually, I got it off Amazon. It's 40 ounces. You can get it in probably like 30 different colors. And, you know, it helps remind me to drink water when I'm sitting here at the computer. And yes, you can decorate it with stickers, all kinds of stuff. You could probably draw on it with Sharpie if you wanted to. Kinds of stuff. So that is just my reminder to myself when I'm sitting here to drink the water, especially when I'm reading, because doing male voices is really hard on my vocal cords. So I have to drink water all the time when I'm reading. The hardest part for me is A, doing male voices, but also making sure that I'm doing the same voice for each for the particular character. No, it's actually a an eclipse. If you look at it, it's actually an eclipse. See? It could be mistaken as an eye though. Yeah, this is another one of my shirts from Into the AM. They are not an official sponsor by any means, but their shirts are incredibly comfortable, and I always shop their site when they have sales because I really like wearing their shirts on stream. They have a lot of space-themed shirts. They have a lot of like kind of nerdy shirts, not necessarily like pop culture, but you know, they don't have any like known fandoms or anything like that. But all of their art is hand-drawn and hand-painted, and their stuff is super comfy, and it's really easy to take care of. So I really like their stuff for just wearing around the house or wearing on stream. No, it's fine. The fact that you're here is what matters to me, so thank you. It is massively comfy, and I'm actually wearing it's actually a t-shirt, see? And I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt underneath that's also from them. They have a... Are you serious? Oh my word. I don't know if I should take that as a compliment, but I'm gonna take it as one. So thank you, Wraith. Wraith is awesome. But yeah, Into the AM stuff is super duper comfy. Yeah, I kind of thought that it was, so I'm taking it that way. Alright. Let's finish out this chapter. I think we've got about 3 pages left. Give me 1 second while I clean my glasses, because apparently even though I don't touch them, get fingerprints everywhere. Anybody else who has glasses that can relate to that, please raise your hand in chat. Because... oh man. Like, I swear I don't touch them, and just fingerprints everywhere, and it's... oh. Yes, it is so difficult when I'm trying to read or do stuff on the computer, and I'm, like, squinting because they're suddenly very dirty again. Ugh. So, totally kind of relate to that because I deal with it constantly. Yes, if your glasses are smudgy, I always keep a microfiber cloth sitting on my desk. Don't clean your glasses on your shirt. That is bad glasses care. That will actually scratch them. So keep a, I actually would recommend a flat weave microfiber cloth better, but this is what I had to hand. This has a weave to it, but the flat weave ones are actually better. How did I know? I'm always yelling at Geo for cleaning his glasses on his shirt. Also known as Stay Alive 7, because he does that constantly. It's all good. I just want your glasses to stay in good shape. That's the important thing. Alright. Do we have about 3 pages left to go before the end of the chapter? Alright. At that, Greer's gaze shifted to the house, lingering on that light. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said before or didn't already live behind his eyes. The girl they watched over had worn her stubbornness like armor since the day they first carried her out of Sirenthal. For anybody who doesn't know, Sirenthal is the Atashir word for hell. There is your vocabulary word for the day. You're welcome. Bare feet, trembling and frozen, compliance needles threaded under her skin like a brand of someone else's cruelty. She had fought her way back, time and again, but tonight, like so many nights before, she looked too small, too worn for the weight she carried, and still she kept carrying it. Down on the south flank, Harris paused, adjusting his rifle sling and angling his head toward the trees. A shape shifted further out, a low, crouched form barely visible under mottled green plating. A glint of light caught briefly on a shoulder plate before disappearing again into shadow. Aran Murda, always on the fringe, keeping his own silent promise, watching not just for threats, but for the ghosts that haunted these woods. Vivek followed Greer's line of sight and saw the faint outline in the distance and gave a subtle flick of his fingers. The hunter's still moving with us. Greer acknowledged it with the barest tilt of his head. Between them, no further words were needed. Aran's presence was another layer of security, one not logged or reported, but just as real as the rifles in their hands. From above, a soft glimmer of light shifted at one of the windows, the faintest movement behind it. Marin. Even from this distance, Greer could picture her there. The gray tunic loose around her frame, the dark trousers hanging uncreased because boots had been left aside. Healing skin raw where burns had carved their path, pale scars still new along her arms and legs. She moved with quiet care now, every step slow, deliberate, as though testing her own strength. He thought of the oath made to her father, the look on Ethan's face when they had carried her from Bastine, thought of the tremor in her fingers when she tried to lift a weapon again after Tanagis. and thought of how many times they'd had to hold the perimeter while she clawed her way back from what the galaxy kept throwing at her. Vex's hand brushed against his own forearm, a deliberate, slow pattern. We keep the silence. We keep her safe. Greer met his gaze and gave the smallest nod, the weight of command and vow locked in that single motion. The mountain wind hissed over stone and pine, carrying away every word they would never say aloud. And so the watch continued. Marines held their ground, a shadow hunter circled the fringes, and above, in the quiet refuge of her own room, Marin Durza lay awake beneath soft sheets, the night air stirring faintly through her window, unaware, or perhaps knowing too well, that those who kept watch had sworn once more that nothing would reach her while they drew breath. Okay. What they carry in silence. Dawn came slowly over Tanagis, pale light creeping through the mist that still clung to the valleys below the Durza estate. The mountain air still carried the bite of the night, sharp enough to sting lungs on the first deep breath. The house remained quiet behind them, only the faint crackle of embers in the hearthrug betraying life inside. Out here, the silence was heavier, laden with memory and oaths neither man would ever speak aloud. Aran stood near the southern overlook, his helmet clipped to his belt, his dark green mottled armor blending easily into the jagged rocks and dense pine. His green eyes swept the tree line below with the same precision that had kept him alive through years spent on the wrong side of a blaster. But his gaze wasn't just scanning for threats. It lingered in the shadows between the trees, on the switchback path and the landing pad that had once carried a shuttle away from this mountain, taking Marin back into fire and blood she'd never deserved. Jared's boots were near silent on the stone path as he approached, the soft, even stride of someone used to moving unseen. He wore only a simple tunic and loose trousers under a weathered cloak, his lightsaber clipped low on his belt. A Jedi on watch, but not here in any official capacity, just as someone who'd seen too much of what pain could do to a person and refused to let it take someone else he cared for. He didn't announce himself. Aran had already glanced over his shoulder once, the faintest tilt of his chin in acknowledgement. For a while they stood without words, only the wind and the distant rush of a mountain stream filling the silence. Jared rested his forearms on the stone railing, his gaze tracing the valley below, his thoughts heavier than he wanted to admit. "You stayed out here all night?" he murmured, his voice low, pitched so it wouldn't carry to the open windows of the estate. Aran's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Old habits. Hard to sleep when I know they're still out there." His jaw flexed, a muscle twitching as he glanced toward the forest. "Harder when I know they've already had her twice." Jared's hand tightened on the edge of the stone. Without letting the force open wide, memory bled through in brief flashes. Not his own, but Marin's. Bare feet scraping against cold metal floors, the prick of needles along her spine, a desperate, stuttering breath in a dark cell on Bastine. He blinked hard, steadying himself. "Ethan saw it first," he said quietly. "Bastine. Callista, Ethan, Greer, they were the ones who pulled her out." Aran nodded slowly, his throat working as if the words were caught there. "Unresponsive," he said at last, his voice gravel rough. Compliance needles under the jaw and down her spine. Stripped down and left with nothing but pain and fear. He stared at his hands, his calloused fingers curling into fists. It wasn't a rescue, Jared. It felt more like they were hauling a ghost out of that place, praying the living part of her came with it. Jared exhaled through his nose, his eyes closing for a brief second as another memory surfaced unbidden. The clearing on Tanagis. Her knees shattered, blood soaking into the dirt as he lifted her, refusing to let her stay there another second. "I know," he said softly. "I wasn't there on Bastine, but I've carried her out before, twice now. Every time it feels like it takes a piece out of her." They fell silent again, the weight of shared knowledge needing no elaboration. Finally, Aran glanced toward the estate, his jaw tightening. This isn't over. Whoever fed them that intel on Collier, whoever thought that drawing her out again was a game, This won't be the last time they try. He shifted his stance, one hand resting on the butt of his blaster. I've seen what Kirat can do to a person. I lived it. I swore when I walked away that I'd never let them make someone else like me. Or like her. Jared looked over at him, steady and unflinching. You're not alone in that. His fingers tapped once on the stone railing, a rhythm faintly reminiscent of the silent codes Greer and Vec used. A promise shared without flourish. I'll be here, always. Aran met his gaze for a long moment before giving a single sharp nod. Then we hold the line, whatever it takes. Behind them, a flicker of light moved in one of the upper windows, the soft gray of Marin's tunic visible as she shifted in her room. Barefoot steps padding quietly over the stone floors. Healing burns still lined her arms and legs, stained raw where fabric brushed wrong, but she moved carefully, determinedly, as if willing herself not to falter anymore. Even from this distance, both men felt it. The same stubborn fire that had carried her through Bastine, Coruscant, Tanagis, and Korriban. The same fire they swore to protect. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. The sun breached the ridgeline, throwing gold light over the mountain, the estate, and the silent sentinels who had chosen, in their own ways, to never let her walk through hell alone again. That is the end of chapter 11, my friends. Ooh, I don't even have a maxim for this one. Give me a second. No. Give me 1 second, because I literally don't know. Well, I will have to find one later. So, for anybody who is curious, I've been putting maxims at the end of the story chapters, and they are pulled from a list that I have, 3 different lists that I have based on the story, or the chapter focus. So these are from 3 different sources. They come from Veil Doctrine Oral Maxims, and the Teachings of Master Stephen Card, and the Durza Creed. So I have been drawing a maxim from each of those 3 sources, well, one of each of those 3 sources for each chapter, so I just haven't selected the one for chapter 11 yet. And for Daz's benefit, because he was not here when I talked about it earlier, I have been working on a language for use in the stories called Atashir. It has 3 written forms. There is a civilian form, there is a military form, and there is a like ritual or sacred form for like use in the temples and stuff. And so I'm building a vocabulary, and eventually I will come up with the actual written forms of the language. So the word Sementhal is the Atashir word for hell. Just so you know. The Mandoa equivalent of that would be Daryaim. Yeah. I use the word, I try to use the Atashir words when it's someone like Vec or Greer or someone who's Katani is using the word. Or if it's Ethan, it will be Mandoa, which is in that particular instance is Daryaim. So just to give, I really wanted to give the story a lot more like cultural depth, so I'm really trying to come up with things that make sense for the story. So I'm building a language We built Veil Protocol. Well, I built Veil Protocol. We have the manual Veil code, which is very similar to like military hand signs, and also we have the haptic pulse code, which is basically the Star Wars version of Morse code. Something like that. So it's just things that I have built that make sense for the story. We have an ad starting in about 5 minutes, but I am actually going to call it here. I was thinking about raiding out tonight, but I think that I should just call it here and get ready for bed because I have to go to work in the morning. So I'm trying to take care of myself and not linger longer than I really want to, so that I can get the rest that I need. That's something that I have been really trying to pay attention to because of the things going on for me health-wise. Really trying to make sure that I get enough sleep. And you guys should try to do the same. I know that sleep can be difficult for some people. So if you know things that help you sleep, maybe it's music, maybe it's white noise. I have a particular routine that I do to tell my body that it's time to go to bed. One of them is shutting everything down. Daz, I don't know if you were around, but within the last 2 or 3 weeks, I actually made the decision to shorten streams by half an hour to an hour. Actually, no, an hour to an hour and a half. Because, especially when I was reading 3 chapters and I was running 3 to 3.5 hours, sometimes 4, and that was really sabotaging my ability to get good rest. So that was one of the things that I did recently, was to shorten the streams to 2 to 2.5 hours max. We're sitting at about 9:30 right now, so that's about 2.5. And also I have reworked the workshops a little bit to really focus on writing workshops and discussion about different types of writing and kind of case studies to really help people, kind of figure out, okay, well, how I want to write this kind of scene, how can I do that? So I've really wanted to start some discussion and dialogue on different types of scenes that you might encounter if you're writing fanfiction or working on a novel or anything of that nature. So that's kind of where I'm at with things. I do believe that my next stream is actually going to be... Let me take a look real quick. Oh my goodness. Let me take a real quick look. So my next stream is going to be it is Wednesday, December 10th. We will be playing some SWTOR. So if you are interested in some silly shenanigans and maybe some cursing, come hang out. That is Wednesday, December 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern, and whatever time that may be for you, wherever you're at, come hang out. We get silly. Hope to see you all there. Once again, thank you to everybody who was here this evening, and I hope you have an awesome night, and please get some good rest, because I'm going to do just that. I will catch you guys a little bit later. Thank you so much, and I'll see you Wednesday. Good night, guys. Yes, I know it's definitely, it's not easy, but it's something that I am really working hard to do, because I really need to. So I really hope that everybody else kind of takes that to heart, because it's a really important thing to do. And you can start with something small, like making sure you drink plenty of water, and kind of work up from there. So And if you have any questions about how I'm doing with my own self-care, I'd be glad to talk about that at any point. It's something that like I said, I'm really trying to work on because of everything that I've been dealing with health-wise. So I've made the intentional choice to adjust stream a little bit to kind of compensate for the fact that I need to take care of myself a little bit more. Hope you guys have an awesome evening and a great start to your week. And thank you again for being here. And I will see you all Wednesday. Have a great night, you guys.